Today we mark the feast of Saint Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury at the end of the 11th century. Italian-born, he became a Benedictine monk at an abbey in France before being made abbot of Bec and Bishop of Evreux in 1079. The abbey at the time became a hotbed of learning and academia. Anselm himself proved to be a notable theologian, spearheading such schools of thought as the ontological argument, the satisfaction theory of atonement, and the necessity of the incarnation. The first of these is the theory that God must at once exist necessarily in the mind and in reality. For existing solely in one or the other means that God is no longer a being than which none greater can be imagined. The treatise Proslogia, in which Anselm comes to his conclusion about God's omnipotence, is in fact less about proving the existence of God. It is rather an extended meditation on the methodology of discerning God's presence. God was self-evident to Anselm. The bishop, and soon archbishop, merely ruminated on the nature, not the question, of God's necessity. Similarly, his argument for the satisfaction theory of atonement states that because there is simply no greater being than God, the recompense for the fall cannot be met by mere mortals who can but conceive of God and not be him. Thus it behooves God to be the incarnate Christ, to provide a sacrifice on par with his own righteousness, yet able to shed human blood. God, as Jesus the Son, had to give of and be given to the abundant nature of himself. You'd be forgiven for having your head spin after engaging with such theological disputes. There was no doubt that Anselm was as devout, prolific, and thorough a philosopher as he was a Christian. And yet, amidst the depth and breadth of his systematic theology, Anselm sought simplicity and purity in his faith. Politically, he sought radical reform of the Church, separating it from influences of empirical, secular authorities. Theologically, one could argue that, like many of us, Anselm wanted to explore the magnitude of the love our Creator bears for us. He wasn't quite like the philosophers of today who think the world could be better off if it was proven that God doesn't exist. Anselm was out to explain the colours and forms of God's inexplicable yet irrevocable essence, the majesty of God. Furthermore, in his theory of atonement, it was not about some kind of business transaction, but a debt of honour. We befouled God's majesty, such that it became our obligation as part of that majesty to restore it. Yet we don't have it in our mortal nature to achieve this. Ergo, Jesus had to be both of equal greatness with God and of equal mortality with man. This point can be illustrated, I believe, parallel to the gospel reading we have today. Jesus says, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. He says this in response to a request for a sign from heaven, such as that of the manna which fell from heaven in the days of the Exodus. Now, in line with Anselm's argument for the God such that there is none greater, surely the existence of the manna in both reality and mentality means that this is a divine phenomenon. Jesus argues that this is a sign from God rather than of God. The manna is not the essence of God, but a material act of such essence. In Jesus' mind, there is bread and there is superlative bread. The kind of bread we hear about in the Lord's Prayer, "Give us today our daily bread." Now, the Greek word for daily in that context is a strange one, epiousion, which can only be translated approximately as supersubstantial. Give us today our supersubstantial bread. When Jesus calls himself the bread of life, the statement beforehand from the crowd is, "Sir, give us this bread always." I would argue that a more appropriate translation would be, "Sir, give us this always bread. Give us this bread that never stops giving. Give us this supersubstantial bread." And this is what Jesus is, an example and embodiment of this supersubstantial bread, this always bread. A bread that nourishes us more than we deserve. Yet its price is cancelled. It is given freely. This bread is our gateway to understanding the essence that sent it. As Jesus says, "For I have come down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of the Father who sent me." Jesus is more than manna. The manna went bad. The manna went mouldy. It was a temporary thing. It disappeared. It was a creation of the divine essence, not the essence of itself. Jesus, by virtue of correcting the crowd, is motioning for us to shift our understanding of truth, to shift our faith, our conviction, to simplify it even. The irony is that we are being prompted to contemplation. We are called to simplify our faith by thinking more deeply and more profoundly about it. The manna may have been a reality for the people of Israel, but it straddles the fine line of idolatry. The understanding of God is not in the material, but in the spiritual understanding of how the material is extended to us. Like I said on Sunday, food is not a meal. The sanctity of the meal comes from the preparation, the invitation, and the sharing of it. Sadly, the generation of Israelites who lived on and venerated the manna is not that far behind us. Both the crowd whom Jesus addresses and many crowds since, even today, neglect that essence of God, that grace by which God becomes both executioner and victim in the incarnation. God is too freely and often too reduced to a clinical material paradigm. He's either there or he's not. If he's there, it's because of hard evidence. If not, it's a lack of evidence. And because matters spiritual are not known for the strength of their material evidence, the strength of critique of matters spiritual continues to rise. But is God something we want to quantify? Do we want God to be just bread? Or do we want God to be this always bread? Supersubstantial bread that continually feeds faith, feeds conviction. Of course, God is not going to shower chopped chip cookies from the sky in order to prove his existence, because, as St. Anselm so rightly puts it, we might think of it, we might see it, but it's not the greatest intellect of which we can conceive. The greatest intellect, and as such one that continues to know no bounds, is compassion. It exists both in reality and mentality, and its existence starts from omnipresence. We know it exists even though people do not always practice it. It's hardwired somewhere deep in here. But continual practice of compassion strengthens our conviction in its epicenter, the living God, the living always bread, that is Jesus, the incarnate God. As we reflect on the theological contributions of St. Anselm, let us reflect also on how we can locate the truth of God's essence in discipleship, in the practice of compassion and invitation, giving as well as taking. How can we partake not in the bread that falls from heaven, not in the quick and easy signs and solutions to deeper problems, but how can we partake in the bread that is heaven, the bread that feeds our gratitude rather than our stomachs? Jesus became for us the bread of life so that our sinfulness could be restored, recovered. It is up to us to honour that bread by being mindful of the one who gave it to us, the one who leads us back to him, and the one who bids us bring others also to know the fullness of his charity.